In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is in our midst. It was not a few years ago now, it's probably going on 10 years, when I started my postgraduate work in Pittsburgh, and I had gone, one of the campuses was at Antiochian Village in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, which is kind of off the beaten path from Pittsburgh. It's about an hour and a half drive away from Pittsburgh. And at the campus there, they had relics of this one saint, Saint Raphael, and I didn't know much about him because he was an Antiochian saint, or is an Antiochian saint. But I remember walking around the campus and seeing this tomb, and it was large. It was a large tomb, and they had a big monument in front of the tomb. And I was walking, they had a little cemetery there, and I looked at the tomb, and I saw that there was a little candili there, a little lit candle, and then the more I looked at it, I noticed that it said Saint Raphael, and that he was actually buried initially at this campus, and it made me wonder exactly who this saint was. So in being at Antiochian Village and being in the class, I learned about Saint Raphael, who had a very unique life. He was born in the Middle East. He went to school in Thessaloniki, and then he went to Halki, and then he went to Kiev, to Russia, and then came to America. And his name is very unique, and that's why it stuck out to me, because his last name is spelled Hawaeeny, which, if you say it too fast, it sounds like Halloween. His last name is Hawaweeny, is his last name. And this is a picture of him here. He died in 1915, and he is considered Saint Raphael of, you'll never guess, Brooklyn. That's his title, Saint Raphael of Brooklyn. Here's his icon here. And as I was, the reason I bring him up today is because yesterday was his feast day. And I always remember it was right around Halloween too, which really kind of, not that we celebrate Halloween or anything, but his last name very much sounds as if it's All Hallows Eve. And I started thinking as I read his life again yesterday, that do we know all the different saints that are in America? Are there saints from Chicago? Are there saints from New York? Are there saints from the West Coast? And there are, and I wanted to share them with you today just to give you a little bit of a background on some of the saints in our area and saints that have originated from the United States. And when I say originated, their ministry was here, and then after here they became recognized as saints. Well, St. John of San Francisco, you've heard me talk about him many times over. We have his icon right there where he's wearing black. We have part of his tomb. We have part of his clothing. We have the sponge that cleaned his body when his relics were discovered, and his relics are incorrupt, as we well know. 2 years ago, God bless you, 2 years ago, we had a retreat in Libertyville, Illinois, at the Serbian monastery and seminary there, and there was another saint that originated from there. And his name is Saint Nikolai Velimirovich, and I've mentioned him many times in my sermons. He's considered the Serbian John Chrysostom. What does that mean? John Chrysostom, we know, wrote the liturgy. We know he wrote many writings. In fact, the interesting thing with St. John Chrysostom, and I think I've mentioned this before, is he is the one that explained St. Paul's letters. So when you read in the Bible, towards the end, the epistles, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, everything that the chanters read in the liturgy, he was explaining them over and over to people and writing these volumes. This is St. John Chrysostom we're talking about. And one of his helpers was in there, and he St. John was writing, and his door was kind of closed, and the person looked through the keyhole of the door and saw this man standing next to St. John, leaning over him and speaking in his ear. And St. John was writing furiously his notes. And then he came back later and he looked, and the man was still there leaning over St. John. And so later, somebody wanted to see St. John Chrysostom, and they said, well, you can't see him because he has somebody in his quarters right now, and they're speaking to him. Then later, St. John comes out of his quarters, and they said, Your Eminence, I'm very sorry. I didn't want to bother you because I saw that you had a visitor. He says, I didn't have a visitor. I was writing the commentary on the Epistle of St. Paul, and I was praying to St. Paul that he would inspire and guide me. So the person who had seen this happen realized when he saw who it was and he put it in his head, he knew that it was St. Paul that was leaning over and speaking in his ear. So in the beauty of the church, and as a remembrance of this, St. John Chrysostom's relics, they have all decomposed, so it's all bone, like we have the bone relics here. But St. John's skull is in a reliquary very similar to a larger size of our St. Nectarios one, a round one. And it has a door on the side, and you open the door, and it's the side of his head, and what is still intact, 100%, is the ear that St. Paul used to speak in. So many people will venerate his relics, and they'll open the door so you can actually see his ear, but everything else is gone except for his ear. St. Nikolai was actually in Libertyville, Illinois for many, many years. He lived here, and he was a prolific writer as well. In fact, he wrote a book called the Ohrid, O-H-R-I-D. And it's readings and writings of the saints every day, and it's very detailed. If you're looking for writings of the lives of the saints and you don't know where to look, type up St. Nikolai Ohrid, O-H-R-I-D, and it brings up a free website. You don't even have to buy the books. Free website, you type in the date, and it brings up the list of the dates, a prayer, a poem, a homily, a reflection. And you know this because I've always put his writings in the Champion. You always see St. Nikolai's writings in the Champion. But he, as well, is a contemporary saint in the church. And his tomb is in Libertyville, and his relics now are throughout the world, as well as St. Raphael. Just recently, there was a church that I took our parish council to again for another retreat, and this is Father John, but he became St. John of Chicago. So you're probably saying, Father Peter's making this up. He's got Brooklyn, he's got Chicago. What is, is it going to be like Aurora East Side next? No, this is St. John of Chicago, and he was a Russian priest who was sent here to be a pastor at the Russian church in the city, in Ukraine village in the city. And he served several years out here. He actually built this icon here, has the scenes of his life. And St. Tikhon was the bishop at the time, actually came to Chicago. But St. John went to, you see the cross he was given there? That was a gift to him for one of his anniversaries as a priest. And he said, the cross is so beautiful, I will never take it off until my death. And what happened was, he went to Russia during the revolution, and his children, because he was a married priest, his children saw him being martyred. He was the first martyr in the revolution. And one of the things that they said was, after they killed him, they took his cross off. And they took his cross and they stole it. And they left his body in the street. But he became one of the first martyrs in the Bolshevik Revolution. So we see here his icon, but if you go to, in the city, to the Cathedral of the Orthodox Church in America, OCA Church, you can see not only his icon that's on the wall, which is this icon, but they also have pictures of him in their history of parish priests, which is, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. So that church is easily accessible as well for us. Recently, a couple years ago, there was this priest as well, who became actually a bishop, and his name is Marjorie. He's another Serbian clergyman who came from Libertyville as well. He was one that they said had a very holy life, and recently as like I said with St. John and some of the other saints, and even St. Nectarios, when they dig up the relics of a saint, they can smell fragrances many times. In fact, out of our relics here that we have, the St. Nectarios relics, you can smell them come through the case. It's just a fragrant relics. Not all relics have fragrances, but St. Nectarios, when they started to get his relics and dig his relics up, as soon as they put the shovel in, they knew that the aroma was coming from the ground. So the same thing with St. Marjorie was, they knew he had a holy life, so they said, it's time to exhume his body and see what's going on. And they exhumed his body, and his body was completely incorrupt. So they had just recently a service of his glorification at that same monastery where St. Nikolai was from. So we have another saint from Chicago. So we have these three saints from Chicago that are in our area. And the reason I bring this up to you is because this is from my personal collection, so it's very small. I keep it in my wallet. Let's see if it'll hook on here. Look at that. There we go. This is an icon that's produced from the Russian monastery, but it has these 6 saints, which are saints of America. So we have St. Peter the Eleusinian, who was a boy who was martyred. We have his icon right there on the bottom in the white, the smaller icon on the bottom. And then to his left there is St. Juvenal, who's right here in this icon. This is St. John of San Francisco, which we have right there. This is St. Tikhon, St. Innocent, and St. Herman, and we have a St. Herman icon next to St. Juvenal. So those are the ones that we could get that were similar to our style of icons here. But this is to give you an idea that many times we'll hear from people that saints are no longer. We don't see saints being made. And I've spoken about this before, that sometimes we feel that, that was a specific group. It doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen around here. It only happens in Greece, or it only happens in Russia or other places. These are visible signs for us, and saints that are in our midst and that we just have to know a little bit about. Now, I don't blame anyone for not knowing all these different saints. It's a continual discovery, and the only way that we can begin to learn the compendium of the saints is to learn about the different ethnic Orthodox too. The Russian, the Serbian, the Albanian, the Ukrainian, the Antiochian, OCA. I mean, all these things beyond just the Greek Orthodox. So we try to have their icons here, but this, like St. Nikolai, this is one of his icons. These are saints that we can reach out to and know that they are watching over us, protecting us, and our friends that were here in our midst. And you think about, for those of you who are older in our congregation, you were living in the same state, almost in the same county as some of these saints that are coming to our attention through the years. Now, is this to say this is the end of the saints that will come? No. Every single day, we discover new saints. And by God's grace, He reveals them to us in the time and in the fashion that God sees best for us. So I wanted to bring this to your attention today just so that you can kind of expand a little bit beyond and realize what we have here too. It's not just in other parts of the world, but it's here as well. And if you are interested I think it would be a good thing. I took the parish council to these two different places, but it would be nice. Many of you have asked me, can you do a Greece trip? Can you do a Cyprus trip? Can you do all these things? But it would be nice to do a trip here where we just go to Chicago and I show you the gems of the city, and I show you the places where these saints lived and where their tombs are and where their relics are as well. So we are very blessed to have the relics that we have in our church, and by God's grace, being able to get even more relics as a gift and as a sign of this great grace. But there are these places too that are around us. So keep that in mind. Don't ever think that you're exempt from the group, and don't think just because there's just men here that women, you're off the hook. We have to also understand that there's many women saints in our church as well, and but these are the ones specifically from America. But there are many women saints who have come into glorification recently that are from other parts of the world, but I'm just bringing to you the ones that are immediately in the United States that we can know and get to understand. So may they continue to watch over us and bless us always. Amen.